I don't know if we have it already. Okay, well, I'll start and then you will need to respond throughout the presentation. But what I would like just to tell you first where we are with the proposal. I think, as you know, I mean, the proposal is out already since the 31st of January, and the two co-legislators are now working on the text. The Council, unfortunately, had only limited number of meetings in the first 6 months in the current presidency, and so there was de facto one full meeting in which the discussion started on the provision. It's not a mystery, I think, to everybody, that the proposal has also received quite some criticism on certain aspects, especially from some member states that have been very vocal in underlying the limitation of the proposal being perceived as too prescriptive and too close to national competence, and in particular for this element what is being often referred to by a mandatory use of the final output. I think that's something that has been highly debated and is still be highly debated. The next step is, of course, that again the Council will continue to work on it, and then the Parliament has already proposed the draft. I mean, the rapporteur for the Parliament has already came up with a number of possible amendments. I think the Parliament, it's not only the Environment Committee, which is the responsible committee that is working on it, but also the other committee in the Parliament, and the Parliament has a quite ambitious agenda in terms of timing. The Environment Committee will discuss already the amendment, the first draft of the rapporteur in early June, and then possibly in July there might be already in September there might be a vote in the committee, and the objective from the Parliament would really be to adopt their position, their proposed amendment already in October. In parallel, of course, the work will continue in the Council, and as we have already said in several occasions, I think that's very important, and that's where I would like to also give you the message in this forum, is that the Commission is, of course, very keen in continuing the discussion with the co-legislator, of course, but also with all of you, with the stakeholders, with the technical bodies, because, of course, it's very important that in this phase your concerns are raised, and the shortcoming that some of the parts of the proposal that have been identified as problematic should definitely be addressed, and hopefully the co-legislator will raise that, and that's why my call, my kind of call to you to really engage in the process now, both with your national representative in the member states and also with the member of the European Parliament, to make sure that the shortcomings that you see in the proposal can be addressed. And of course, we are always available to clarify some of the provision that have, the proposal as we have proposed. We have had also a number of bilateral meetings with a number of stakeholders, our commissioner of patient, professional, providers, and industry. So he's having a set of bilateral meetings in the last 4 weeks. He had already 3, and now I think the only group that has not yet met is with the industry, and that meeting will come up soon. So this is all our attempt to try to explain and clarify a proposal which it is technical, but is also turned to be very political in the current discussion, and we believe it's important that a solution to those. Just a few points that I would like to stress in this. It's really what we have tried to do with the proposal in terms of what are the key elements that we have presented. I think it's important to underline that one of the key principles that we want of the cooperation on HTA in the future is a system that is driven by the national authority, by the members. We call it a member states-driven approach. And that's important because, of course, some of the articles, the wording of some of the articles has been a bit misinterpreted and probably was obviously not clear enough to give this message. I think the intention of the proposal was to clarify that any joint output, being a joint assessment, a joint scientific consultation, a guidance document for a methodological consideration, these are all documents that are developed by national authorities, by national experts appointed by the national authorities. That will be part of this coordination group that would be the main governing bodies of the cooperation. So the scientific work, the science is done where the experience and the expertise and the knowledge is, which is in the member states country. And what the Commission can offer to the cooperation is a bit more the support framework. So the secretariat support in terms of logistics, in terms of IT infrastructure, in terms of scientific support. I mean, you need to have a number of scientists to support the scientific work, to understand what the reports are all about, but there is definitely no intention to have any Commission official drafting a report on joint clinical assessment. On this, I think I can reassure everybody in this room. I mean, as a role in our proposal in terms of publishing the output of the work. So the joint clinical assessment and the joint clinical assessment and all any output the Commission will publish. And in the moment the Commission publishes this work, the Commission becomes liable for the content. So for these reasons, the Commission has, and you may have seen in some of the articles where the Commission is giving comment or something, the rationale behind this provision is, again, to make sure that the process and this, that are followed are in line with what the cooperation and the member states have agreed. And that's the kind of supporting role of in the scientific cooperation. And I think that's another important role, in a way, that indeed the Commission is taking over. And the reasons why this role, and I think it's actually why the Commission is taking this role, is because you need to have, once there is a joint clinical assessment, somebody needs to be liable for its content. If somebody wants to challenge it to court, it will not be the assessor, the co-assessor, the reviewer, or let alone the coordination group, but it will be the body who has published the report, which will be the Commission. So in view of this, we do need some reassurance to have the possibility to follow the process in the development of the joint output. This was the reason why the Commission is referred in some of the articles where the scientific work is, the process for the production of scientific work is present. And I think I want to clarify this as well, because again, having said what I said before, it's not the idea that the Commission drafts, it's simply that the Commission should follow the process and accompany the process to make sure that the quality standard, the SOP, the inclusion of the relevant, and the steps which are agreed are actually followed properly. And it has then the possibility at the end to say, well, if everything has been followed, of course, the Commission received the report and published it. If there are any doubts that maybe the process was not as transparent, as inclusive, or whatever, it has the right to send it back to the coordination group, say, look, this and this happened, maybe you want to have a second look. And that's really that's what the role of the Commission in this whole cooperation would be from our proposal. The other element which I think it's important also to clarify is the focus on the clinical aspect and the differences between, what is a joint report looking like. I think the ones of you that are familiar with the joint clinical assessment, well, with the REA from EUnetHTA, you will understand how a joint clinical assessment would look like. It's not a report that says technology A is better than technology B, but it's a scientific assessment on the evidence available. So we are really focusing on the assessment, and we are not looking about joint appraisal, joint economic evaluation. These are very context-specific elements where we understand from the input received in the preparatory phase and from the discussion within EUnetHTA and with the member states as well, where we see the European added value is probably limited. It would be much more difficult to find consensus and to have something that is usable and useful for the member states in their decision-making process. So, of course, we also recognize that clinical aspect. In some country, there is some combination between the clinical assessment and economic assessment. We are aware of that. We also believe that there are a number of solutions that can be found to ensure that you still have an important added value on the joint work on clinical assessment, and you can continue your national decision-making process building on the clinical evidence that have been assessed jointly at the European level. I think one of the points, and I think that came out also very strongly this morning from the first session, the importance of the availability of high quality and timely output. And maybe I should amend these slides by now, having heard the discussion again today. Quality has not been so far a big issue in joint work. I mean, I think in some instance this has also been raised as a concern, but I think from the evidence we have is more the time. The time, having a joint assessment which is of good quality, comprehensive and usable, it's key that is available as early as possible in the process to make sure that everybody can actually take it up and build on it in its own national decision-making process and use it in the national decision-making process, not to repeat the work which is done jointly, which is one of the shortcomings of the current model of cooperation. That brings me to the other point, which is the use of the joint work, what has been often referred as the mandatory aspect of this whole proposal. I think here all what we want is to make sure that what is done jointly is taken up and used in the national decision-making process and is actually not redone systematically and is not just ignored. And that's a very important element for us, because we believe also logically it's difficult to defend that we set up a system which is quite, how can I say, it's quite developed in the sense you have a governance structure, you have a group of member states, subgroup of experts, everybody comes together, discuss, agrees, fight to get a consensus on a scientific document, which is not always, as you know, an easy task, but it is a possible task, and the EUnetHTA has demonstrated that this is a possible and useful task. And then when the output is there, you just go back and redo it because maybe it's not exactly the way you would have done at home. And I think that's what we say it's not acceptable from a European perspective, but once we should make sure that the process is inclusive, is of high quality, and provides everybody the chance to give the major and higher quality input possible. But once there is a consensus and an agreement on something done jointly, that should be used and applied and taken up rather than repeated. So, and that's a bit this element of the non-duplication that we believe it's a crucial element of this proposal, with the understanding as well that has to be proportionate in the sense that, when other aspects which are context-specific are necessary for the national decision-making process, this shall not be, the joint clinical assessment shall not prevent the member states to add on that. Fit for purpose, I think this is what we also added this very clear message in the preparatory phase on the proposal, the fact that, it's actually not one medtech, but there are thousands of different variation types and numbers of devices as well, and their market access path is very different, much more decentralized. There is it's a much less harmonized approach. Notify only a rather the proposal. We are much less ambitious in terms of what could be the numbers of joint clinical assessment for medical devices, and I think that's also learning from what is happening in EUnetHTA, where the most, let's say, used tools for cooperation between HTA bodies on joint clinical assessment is what we called in the EUnetHTA jargon the collaborative assessment, that are assessments which are relevant to a lower number, a subset of member states, which may be 4, 5, 6, which still find extremely beneficial to cooperate on that, and that was also not only scientifically, but also in terms of efficiency of resources, and I think Claudia this morning was quite you know, enlightened on this element as well. And we believe, and that's what we heard from the HTA bodies, there is a willingness and a need to cooperate also on medical devices, but with different probably process, timing, and as well tools. And that's what we have tried to reflect in the proposal. And we'll also see in any governance structure, while you see this one slide that could maybe visualize how the whole system could work, de facto you could duplicate this, because we say for each of the subgroup there would need to be a formation which is with bodies responsible for medical device and body responsible for pharma, also to reflect the fact that this is the situation in several countries, not everywhere, but when this is the case, different agency has to be involved, because you want to make sure that the expertise is in the agency that have responsibility and in that domain. Last but not least is the transparency and independence. I think what we have tried to put in place with this framework, it's really a mechanism where we facilitate the cooperation between member states on HTA, on the needs of HTA in terms of evidence requirement, in terms of objective. I mean, HTA bodies have a different objective than regulators, have a different objective than and then, of course, technology developers, and we are trying to help them to come together and actually set a bit their evidence requirement versus the developers and versus also other decision-making process. And that's where we think it's probably the added value from that. And the independence of the system from technology developer is a key principle, which we have had very strong, we have heard very loud and clear from in the consultation phase, the possibility to charge fees, the possibility to, the interaction with the technology developer, which has to happen because, we all have the same objective of having products that are accessible to patients, but at the right time with the right modality. And this is something that, even though probably we are not very clear on the implementing measure, if I could say so, in the proposal, this is the principle we want to implement by saying, technology developer, submission dossier have to be defined, evidence requirement, involvement of the technology developer, but also of the stakeholders, other stakeholders like patient, clinical expert, and in the development of the joint work, really, so in the report, to provide the point of view of the patient, to provide the point of view of the clinical expert in the development of the assessment, but also more generally in the proposal, we foresee a stakeholder network that could really also have a consultative engagement. I mean, it's a pool to be that is part of the governance structure and is consulted and provides its input on the more general document like methodological guidelines, supporting document, annual work program, and I think we heard in the earlier session also the importance of the involvement of the key players, including all stakeholders, in the horizon scanning, in identifying, for instance, the technology where joint work has a best added value. So I think that's another element where we believe the proposal address, maybe have again to be further detailed and clarified, and we have seen quite some interesting ideas in the draft report of the Parliament, but I think that's what was all meant to be, because we believe it is important that HTA is hopefully continues in its, the cooperation on HTA continues, and we should try to build a system that really relies on the best practice that we have, I'd say the lack of having in Europe, because we should not forget that we are one of the parts of the world which HTA is highly developed. We are a model, and even EUnetHTA is a model globally in terms of the success of making HTA bodies working together. And I think that's what we have tried in the proposal to bring, let's say, to the next step. Pragmatic approach, I think, well, I like to say this for my Italian origin, Rome was not built in a day, so there needs to be there needs to be a time phase, a timing in phase. We have foreseen, a delayed application. We had foreseen a transitional period to actually make sure that there is actually some time between the preparatory phase, once the proposal hopefully is adopted. There is time to prepare and to make sure that all the building blocks, the tools and the guidelines are there. We won't start from scratch because we have heard also this morning, and I hope we'll continue to discuss in the last session, that there is a lot that EUnetHTA will provide. And then, from the application, there will be a phase-in time where member states can decide on the scope, on the numbers, and things will gradually build up until hopefully a system is fully in place by the end of the transitional period that in our planning is 2027. So we had the challenge to set out a system today that de facto is operational in 10 years from today. And it was not an easy challenge with all the input that EUnetHTA is providing and others. So we have tried to bring in the proposal some hooks. Maybe we will have more, hopefully, through the co-legislation process to build and to implement already now, but we need to think of the balance between what we can put in a legal text and what needs to be developed as a follow-up legislation and as a follow-up guidance document. So that's a bit what I wanted to share with you. I think we had a question. I'll try. Let's put this question on. Well, that's the answer I wanted to actually see. I post with your permission. I will probably use it in some of my selling exercise of this proposal, but because beside jokes, I think. Thank you very much. No, but beside joke, I think it's very important to put everything in the right context. We are trying to set up here a framework of cooperation for the future. And the framework we have proposed is probably, and surely it's not the perfect one, but the point today is, do we want to fix it, the problems, and make it working, or we want actually to run the risk that the cooperation stops with the joint action tree, at least from an EU funding perspective and EU coordination perspective. And I think that's the real challenge now, which we have to face in the weeks to come. So I'll leave it here, and I'm sure we will have time, maybe not now for questions, but throughout the rest of the afternoon and in the last session of the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Oh, but then we don't. No. Oh. Thanks very much, Flora. Thanks for that presentation and the interesting poll. So everyone, I'm sure, got a shot of that one. So we'll now move into our next session entitled Taking Lifecycle Approach to EUnetHTA's Work, Current and Future Collaboration Between Early Dialogues and Relative Effectiveness Assessments. We're going to be kind of casual here. I think we're going to be sort of going back and forth in terms of presentations, so there won't be anyone going up to the podium. We'll just pass this around. You heard Flora reference the joint clinical assessments, or joint assessments and early dialogues, or joint scientific consultations, that term. These activities are run out of different work packages. But how can we ensure that EUnetHTA isn't siloed in its thinking? So I'm going to steal a little bit of Francois's thunder here. I think you're starting off, and I'm going to just show this slide. I think I showed this slide in every single EUnetHTA presentation that I did. I don't know who created this slide and when it was created, but I don't know if there were royalties attached to this. He or she would be quite wealthy.
I think Wim was at the origin of this slide.
Great job. It's a legacy for sure. So. I think, you know, it depicts a lovely story of sort of, you know, the life cycle of a technology. You know, certainly where advice is given in the development phase, you know, that could feed into a joint clinical assessment. Any uncertainties could be managed, you know, in certain terms of in the post-licensing phase. But is this happening in EUnetHTA currently? I will say that I think this is ambitious even for one agency in one country to sort of execute this well. So it becomes even more challenging in a cooperation like EUnetHTA. So what is EUnetHTA already doing to achieve some of this linkage between, in particular, Work Package 4 and Work Package 5? Are there changes coming that might precipitate greater collaboration between the work packages? You know, what opportunity does this you know, very continuous or collaborative approach offer EUnetHTA and certainly its products? And on the flip side, what is the risk if EUnetHTA carries on and sort of or approaches this in a very siloed or separate way? So with that, I'll introduce colleagues, and I'll do them all at once. I think this is probably the easiest way, and it will be quite brief, because I think many of them are known to all. So first we have Dr. Francois Mayer from HIS. Francois trained in internal medicine and endocrinology. He's currently advisor to the president. I always have to say the president of HIS, because sometimes people just sort of leave that out, or have it in brackets, and you know. But he's held various functions within HIS over the years and with the French Medicines Agency. Dr. Hannah Brule represents the Work Package 5 co-lead partner. Since 2015, Hannah's been a scientific advisor and EUnetHTA coordinator at the GBA, at the Federal Joint Committee here in Germany. Sari Ormstad is a senior advisor with NIFNO, the Norwegian Institute for Public Health, and is representing the Work Package 4 lead partner. Sari has a bachelor's degree in library and information science from Oslo University College and a master's in public health from the School of Health and Related Research in University of Sheffield. And Professor Claudia Wild, who I've already introduced once before, is director of EUnetHTA and is representing the co-lead, Work Package 4 co-lead partner for other technologies. And I think, Francois, you're up first, right?
I think so, more or less. You can, yeah.
There. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I don't know which one. Yes, this one is perfect. Good afternoon, and yeah, jumping into, so this is a slide you've just seen, so I'm not going to, to show it again. Yes, we have these two work packages, and I will start together with Hannah to recall what are the tasks and the remit, what is the remit, and what is the actions of the WP5. We touched a bit upon this morning on what WP5 is doing. So the working on the life cycle approach of evidence generation. So we have 38 partners from 22 countries collaborating in this work package. So the objective of this work package is to help the generation of the best possible evidence to avoid a situation where we have to assess a technology, but we do not have, that may be very promising, but we do not have the adequate data to conclude and to make an evidence-based assessment. So that's why we want to have some interactions, but in a very well-defined and limited way to avoid to be co-developer of this technology, of course. So this is divided into two activities, this work package. The first one, strand A, is on early dialogues that were mentioned this morning, for which GBA is the Federal Joint Committee in Germany is a co-lead partner, and so we continue to develop the early dialogues or parallel consultations that were already started during Joint Action 2 and on the occasion of the SEED project for the ones of you who have known this EU-funded project, and so we have added activities on the data collection that may be requested for some technologies in the post-launch situation. So additional data generation, post-launch evidence generation. So again, a new acronym, PLEGS, and also dedicated on, with some activities focused on registries. For this activity, we have partners more active, that are the activity centers, IFA in Italy, TLV in Sweden, EUnetHTA in Spain, and NICE in the UK. So we want to improve these additional and observational data collection collected after the launch of a new technology. The main activity is to have pilots, but another important activity is to produce a standards tool to assess the quality of registries for their use in the EUnetHTA environment. So that's a general description of the activities of the work package 5. And now I'll give the floor to Hannah to give you the highlights of the main activities related to work package 5A on early dialogues.
Yes, thank you, Francois. So, yes, this is just to provide you an overview and a short reminder of where we are in terms of early dialogues for pharmaceuticals. So we set up the Early Dialogue Working Party, which is basically a stable group of experienced HTA bodies, also with sufficient availability to guarantee, so to speak, consistency across early dialogues. And this Early Dialogue Working Party currently is comprised of several HTA bodies with a permanent seat. This is HAS from France, GBA from Germany, NICE from the UK, IFA from Italy with an alternate partner, RER, a regional body, the Hungarian HTA body, NIPPON, and then we have a setup of the Dutch and Belgian HTA bodies who have a shared seat, that would be ZIN and Resifinami. And we are currently discussing the possible extension of that Early Dialogue Working Party in the future to a Spanish seat and also a sort of Nordic seat shared between Norway and Sweden. So what are the products that you can, or the products we offer in terms of early dialogue? So you can apply for both a multi-HTA early dialogue and a parallel consultation together with the EMA. And within this parallel consultation, we have two different pathways. One that involves the Early Dialogue Working Party for highly prioritized products. And then there's another pathway that we call EUnetHTA facilitated. So it's still, the application goes through the EUnetHTA Secretariat and is supported administratively at the EUnetHTA level, but there's an individual participation or voluntary participation by the individual HTA bodies in a similar fashion as had been the case in the prior model at the EMA, the Parallel Scientific Consultation. So for those parallel consultations where we have the involvement of the working party, we appoint always a scientific coordinator and a rapporteur who are in charge of the coordination amongst the HTA bodies, interaction with the EMA, and also will present the consolidated positions and perspectives at the face-to-face meeting. But as Chantal already mentioned earlier today, we are very close to the launch also of the early dialogues for medical devices. So we anticipate the launch for the early third quarter of this year. And as a matter of fact, we have already identified also 2 candidates there. So this is an activity that's going to start soon. To come back to the pharma early dialogues, just to let you know, and these numbers have changed a little bit over the past few days, how many of those we have conducted or are in the process of conducting. So as had already been mentioned before, also it's a product with a very high demand for that, and that makes sense, of course. And we've received 33 plus, I think now a handful this week, more letters of intent for early dialogues. And of course, a large portion of those were requests in the field of oncology, but that's not surprising. And then various other indication fields. And about half of those early dialogues were conducted with the involvement of the Early Dialogue Working Party. And the other half went into the individual parallel consultation stream, where there are less HTA bodies, about 1 to 3 on average. And in the EUnetHTA early dialogues, there's the Working Party plus maybe a few additional partners. Also, very importantly, we've involved patients in the majority of those early dialogues that involved the Working Party, so in roughly 80% of those. And we are currently trying several modalities of patient involvement in those. And we are also not just involving them, but of course want to make it visible where their input was fed into the advice that was formed at that time from the different HTA bodies. So we are trying to make this very transparent and visible in the final report also, where patient input fed into the advice.
For this important activity, so we have shared the role of scientific coordinator and rapporteur between the lead partner and the co-lead partner, and we have so all the individuals involved in this activity are there if you want to ask them questions. We have we have a strong secretariat at the HAS level with Maggie Galbraith, we have Chantal Guillaume, and we have Stéphanie Saïd from GBA who also are involved in this activity. So if you want to ask them a lot of practical questions, don't hesitate during the break. And so that's for this activity, but we have also this other activity that is on post-launch evidence generation. Maybe I should mention that in some occasions, and maybe more and more often, we have a discussion during an early dialogue on what sort of post-launch evidence should be produced So the discussion is mainly on the initial evidence generation to support the marketing authorization, but more and more often we have also some questions from the companies or what sort of additional observational data collection should take place after launch. So that makes the transition with the other activities and the pilots on post-launch evidence generation. So that's about the additional data collection that could be needed after the launch of the product when there is, of course, some uncertainty. And this happened for innovative technology that it was mentioned in the session this morning. So we have produced some tools for this activity, starting in the past joint actions. The first one in the criteria to select the technology for which it's really useful to have a plague, and that is a document produced in the past, and we have updated it for this current joint action. How to work together? We need to analyze the evidence gaps and define the research question. So how to work together to define the research question. We have a document on that. How to choose the methodology to answer the questions, how to produce a core protocol template, and what we are producing now is pilot templates and documents, and the tool that I mentioned that is coordinated by NICE on the quality of registries. So we have a lot of tools available on the EUnetHTA website. You can look at them. Now, what are we doing in terms of pilots? So the pilots consist, what are we doing? So we are assessing a new technology, drug or non-drug, and we find evidence gaps, uncertainty evidence gaps. So we have to analyze that, to agree on this analysis. Then we have to agree to define the research question and to see what would be the requirements, what would be the type of data that would be needed to answer and to fill in these evidence gaps. How the data collection can be set up, and of course, EUnetHTA is not organizing or funding a data collection, so it has to be organized based on what exists, and generally speaking, it's at a national level. It can be quite different from one country to another, and then to see how we can pool the data at individual level or the results of various countries to get some more significant information than if we have stayed at the national level. So for this activity, we have two types of pilots. The one is specific of products that are proposals coming from EUnetHTA, coming from the activity centers that I mentioned earlier. And we have currently two ongoing pilots and one about to be launched. Two on drugs, one on an orphan drug coordinated by IFA, and one on a breast cancer drug coordinated by TLV that is being launched now. And these pilots we should end at the mid-2019. And we have a pilot on medical device coordinated by EUnetHTA in Spain, and that will be launched soon. So that's the product-specific pilot. So it's not an advice given then to the companies. We agree ourselves on the data requirements, and that should take place. And of course, it's a work that is at the exploratory phase, because that's something that has never been done in the past. So we'll see and analyze from this pilot what are the limits, what are the possibilities to work together on this field. Then we have also a disease-specific approach that we do in collaboration with EMA. Actually, the EMA proposed EUnetHTA to join them for a new activity put in place at EMA, that is the qualification procedure that existed at the EMA for a novel methodology to develop drugs, but that has been applied for the first time this year to registries. So these registries, we have two pilots that have been carried out. We follow the procedure of the EUnetHTA, of the EMA, but for the time being, we do not think that we can have a positive opinion for the qualification on a registry. What we're going to produce is an advice to the registry holders to give them what are the strong points and what should be changed in their registries to meet the requirements of HTA, both on the aspect of the quality of the registry and the aspect of the type of data that are collected. So these are the main activities of this work package, and it should be very important for new innovative technologies. Now, to stop with the WP5 and to jump into the collaboration with two work package, just a simple situation to show why we need this collaboration. When we are working on the pilot to define, as I mentioned, we have first to analyze, so the assessment of the drug has to start, the drug of the medical device has to start at the HTA body. Then we have to analyze the evidence gaps, to define the research question, to set up the data collection. That are the process we have to do. And of course, for a drug, for instance, after the marketing authorization, we know that all HTA bodies will evaluate the drug roughly at the same time, but roughly at the same time. And then the devil is in the details. And of course, the timings are not exactly the same. So as you can see on this slide, one agency can be start the assessment at a time where another agency has already concluded on the research question. So if we decide to start at the time of the marketing authorization, we will face the situation where it will be difficult to define jointly the research question, the evidence gap and the research question, because some agency will already have made their conclusions on that, and sometimes they already have set up a data collection. For instance, in Italy, some drugs will be available only if the register that is organized by IFA is in place. So, there are difficulties, so really need to try to identify the products for which we want to work on plagues before. That's why we thought of the possibility to collaborate. Of course, the first possible collaboration is between strand A and strand B of the work package 5. It's the blue arrow number 1 on the bottom of the slide. That is to promote the plague discussion during early dialogues, to be sure that we have identified that there will be some activity that will take place at the time of marketing authorization for plague. So that's the first one. And then the second one, of course, and I will hand over to our colleagues from work package 4, is to see whether For instance, at the time, can you help us to identify these products when you do your joint assessment? So that's a question for you, Sari. Can you help us?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the arrow number 2 that goes from joint assessments to the post-launch evidence generation. Because I think this is quite concrete opportunity for collaboration between Work Package 4 and Work Package 5, and namely to use joint assessments and the evidence gaps that we identify during the assessments, again, to identify candidates for post-launch evidence generation. And what we did prior to this forum and when we were preparing the presentation, we took a very brief look at the published recent EUnetHTA assessments. There were 3 assessments that were published on pharmaceuticals and 6 assessments on other technologies. And these are some of the evidence gaps that we identified. Among others, we saw in one assessment, research for certain populations or subgroups were missing. Research for certain comparators were lacking. And we also saw that it was not possible in all assessments to do direct comparisons. So we saw indirect comparisons were used. Also outcomes. There were a number of outcomes where research evidence couldn't be identified. Just some examples: overall survival, health-related quality of life, patient satisfaction, and adverse events. There were also some assessments that pointed out that there is lack of robust study designs and additional research is needed to support the findings in the assessments with high quality evidence. So these are just examples of evidence gaps that could be fed into the work of Work Package 5B and support the formulation of research questions for post-launch evidence generation. Now I'm going to talk about another opportunity that we have discussed prior to the presentation within the 2 work packages, and namely number 1, the dotted line. We discussed whether there could be some link between the TISP work, topic identification, selection, and prioritization of Work Package 4, and early dialogues of Work Package 5. And there were really 2 questions that we ask ourselves. And if I start with the first one, can horizon scanning be used to identify technologies that are relevant for early dialogues? And I think already now there is alignment on prioritization criteria between early dialogues and horizon scanning and the work that the TISP task group is conducting. So that is beneficial for collaboration, for sure. But I think the challenge is that for the time being, horizon scanning doesn't occur early enough to inform early dialogues. It was mentioned in session 2 that horizon scanning in Joint Action 3, the main purpose of horizon scanning is to identify topics for joint assessments. So currently, I don't see how to collaborate, but as Ingvild mentioned in session 2, there is a draft recommendation for post-2020 that is developed by the TISP group. And the draft recommendations, they mention that horizon scanning is suggested to support early dialogues as well. as we saw in session 2, horizon scanning is a very complex, comprehensive topic. I'm not going to go into that, but there are possibilities to discuss things further and work on it. And I give the floor to Francois for the second question.
Second question. Yes, yeah, because the influence can be on one way or the other. And so early dialogues, can they be used to inform TISP process, topic identification, selection, prioritization? Of course, we got information at an early stage before the clinical trials take place, but these early dialogues are confidential. So it may be the limit. A dialogue with the pharma industry and the medical devices industry would be helpful to see how we can use the information we have here without breaching the confidentiality rules. Because, of course, basically a product accepted for a EUnetHTA early dialogue, we have some prioritization criteria because we do not have enough resources to say, yes, we were going to engage the working party for all requests. We do not have the resources for that, so we have selection criteria. And so there are good chances that the products would be of interest for joint assessment. So it is our hope that we can do something without creating a sort of problem with our relationship with the company, and I think it would be beneficial for everybody. So that's hopefully there will be an option to that. Maybe we will discuss that during the discussion later, if you agree with that. And this one, yeah, I think it's again mine. Okay. So the next question is not a question, but is a possible link that we would like to highlight on a link between early dialogues and joint assessments. It's just that if we do these early dialogues, it's because we hope that they could have an influence, because having this dialogue and this meeting and this exchange, answering the question from the company, will help to generate better evidence and then facilitate the needs, facilitate the conduct of a joint assessment, because and improve the quality and the final quality of the process, because the evidence will be more adapted than if the company would have just decided by herself without trying to know whether their choices for the development plan were appropriate or not. So that's our hope, and of course, for the time being, we do not have evidence to support that, but the way to evaluate that in the future is an important question. And then I give the floor back to you, Sari, for the last slide.
Reassessment, that was discussed or mentioned briefly in an earlier session. So, so I think that's something that should or could considered, that to conduct reassessments, among others, based on the additional evidence generation and the results from that. Now the work in work package 5 in the post-launch evidence generation is still in a preliminary stage, so I think it's a bit early to think about not to think about reassessment, but really concretely have concrete suggestions on how to do reassessments and how the process should be, how those additional evidence generation and reassessment should be linked together. But I think it's important to discuss reassessments, and maybe this forum could be used today to bring forward some ideas. Is it important feasibility to do it on a national level, or maybe it's relevant within EUnetHTA, things like that. So thank you. That was the last slide.
Okay.
I feel left out of the group of three. You are so well aligned, and I'm not aligned. Also, I will talk about alignment now. Okay. Maybe the difference is that you were talking about the near future, and I will talk about the possibilities for collaboration in the middle far future. maybe, or I assume that most of you all are aware that we have a new medical device regulation. Actually, we have two, the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic regulation since mid-2017. And those regulations, those new regulations are directly applicable into national law. It's EU law, but it's directly applicable. We have a transition period from 3 to 5 years, 3 years for the medical devices and 5 years for the in vitro diagnostics. And we are not just now in the process that the notified bodies that have been 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 115 years. 2 years ago, there were 70 left, and I don't know what to prospect, how many will stay. But the whole area of medical device regulation is in the process of being reorganized, totally reorganized. So, and one part of the reorganization that gives a lot of hope to us as the EUnetHTA community is that there are new requirements for better clinical evaluations, because in the old medical device directives, there are only safety and performance data were requested or required for CE marking, and until now for the high-risk devices, those are the class 3 and 2B, or class C and D with the in vitro diagnostics. Better clinical evaluations are required. So it is our hope that there will be better data for assessments coming. Within this new regulation, there are three elements in which there is room for collaboration. This is the development of device-specific guidances, and that's why I'm sitting here on the podium, of course, I think it's at Article 45 in the regulation, the scientific advice that should be set up in the legislation, not in HTA. We talk about the legislation now, on giving advice on the development plan and the design of clinical evaluations, and after the launch or after the approval, further collections of data, namely registries. So there is a huge window of opportunity with the new legislation setting the regulatory framework for new activities, but with the implementation not in place yet. So there is a huge opportunity that all stakeholders, be it the regulator, the clinicians, the manufacturer, but also HTA, start to talk to each other in order to, as our colleague from EMA put it very nicely, to have a smooth generation of data along the whole chain of evidence generation. And if there are anxieties or fears that approval and HTA will all become to a big something, then I have to destroy these anxieties, because HTA will for sure always stay a distinct process after approval, asking not for many additional data, but for the right data. And this is what the collaborations might be all about, to start at the scientific advices in the beginning, already to set up the studies, the clinical trials in a way so that the data are usable for HTA, for approval as much as for HTA later on. So, but those two process steps will always stay distinct, because approval is there to ask for the benefit and benefit risk assessments, while HTA will always ask for added benefit in comparison to comparators or to other interventions in the field, and for effectiveness and not only for efficacy. But as I said, we really hope for better clinical data and for a far more transparent process of how medical devices are being approved in Europe. And of course, we look for better communication between a regulator and HTA. And for these reasons, next week on Tuesday, there will be a meeting, the first workshop between regulators and HTA community in order to start this exchange. It's the very first beginning, and when the two partners come together and they haven't been talking to each other before, then language and understanding is the main issue, and not so much to have outputs or to have a roadmap for the next 5 years what we will do. So our expectations for the next meeting are that we start to understand each other, the mindset where we are coming from, in order to either approve or to assess medical devices. So, three of us, Stefan Sauerland, head of Department of Other Technologies in IQWiC, Petra Schnell-Indest, first author or main author of the medical device guidance within EUnetHTA, and we wrote a paper. I think it could be called a proposition paper, what might be the next steps forward in order to close a bit or to narrow the gap, the large gap between the requirements for the approval of medical devices and the requirements for HTA or reimbursement. And not surprising, this smoothing the process and aligning the methods are along the usual lines, the lines we already know from the scientific advices in the drug area. It's the study design, the trial design, the outcomes, the comparators, etc. And with this, I can close. And you will see those slides again, hopefully with a little bit more content next year, because I don't have the hope that within the next year a lot of things will happen. Only that we will repeat it monotonously, that there is room for collaboration.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much, Claudia. You weren't excluded from the group of three, but I'm glad you were patient. And maybe before I open it up for questions, I actually might pose a question to you, Claudia. I think you're probably the most familiar in terms of the people, in terms of the EUnetHTA people around the new regulations. And are you able to get into a bit of the details, or at least could you compare or contrast what's proposed with respect to the early dialogues like activity with what EUnetHTA is currently doing or has done or proposed to do within Joint Action 3 and has done within SEED and Joint Action 2? Do you have any of those details?
I ask my colleagues. I've never attended an early dialogue. I have no idea how it works. So maybe you can answer how the early dialogues, what the difference between the early dialogues of pharma and the early dialogues of medical devices might be. And I ask you also to invite me for the first early dialogue on medical devices.
I see collaboration already happening.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a nice outcome of this session. Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah, I mean, we've done some early dialogues in Joint Action 2 and the SEED project, and it's clear that there are specificities for medical devices, because the way they enter the market is different than the way pharmaceuticals enter the market. What is difficult is that this pathway is quite different from one country to the other, and actually, we did not advertise for the launch of early dialogues on medical devices, but we were approached by several companies. So there is interest to have this exercise completed. So we will learn more with the new ones. It's clear that there may be an interaction. Not only the clinical consequences may be important for a medical device, but also the impact on the healthcare organization, the local organization, the way the comparative treatments are funded may have an impact. So that's so. In the ideal situation, we will have something European, but also representative of various stakeholders at a national level. So this we can't do, but we certainly will be able to answer the most important questions that are not really context-specific and help the development of new devices. But really, we have limited experience for the time being, but we are happy to see that there is an interest from individual companies for these activities, and more than happy to have you attending the meetings.
Thanks very much. I open it up to questions. So I think just Beata, I think we could have a microphone.
Beate Wiesler from EQUIC. Thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, what we have seen is that there is a high demand, and Francois was describing that you can't even answer all these requests. And at the same time, from our own experience in SEED and in Joint Action 2, early advices, I felt that the questions that were raised by the companies were pretty generic concerning study populations, comparators, endpoints, things like that. Therefore, actually, I would like to challenge the model of confidential individual scientific advice. I mean, I wonder if we meet the needs better with shifting that to the public and providing this required advice to a broader range of companies, helping more companies and being more aware of our scarce resources to do that. I think specifically for the post-licensing evidence generation, I mean, the report, the joint assessment describing the gaps is publicly available anyway, so why not discuss in the public what is the evidence requirements left and what is the best way to address them. So actually, I don't really see a reason to continue with this type of model.
Yeah. First, just to clarify with the fact that we cannot accommodate all the needs. Actually, yes, we do not say no to any request for, at least for the parallel consultation, but we cannot always engage the entire working party. So if it's not for the working party, there will be a parallel consultation, that is individual parallel consultation, that is similar to what existed before the EMA level, called a parallel scientific advice. So just to clarify that for the audience. Then I follow you, I would say partially. I say the limits you indicate of the product-specific and confidential nature of early dialogues, I do agree with that. And actually, maybe someone from industry can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, in a meeting at the EMA in last April, communication from the industry saying their views on the future of early dialogue, saying that they were not against the fact that if there are some facts that could be of interest for other products developed in the same indication, and that will not breach, disseminate some confidential information, they are totally happy if we make them public. So that's something that's an evolution we have to think of, the possibility to what can we make public for other products developed in the same indication, or can we go further and say for this indication, a new product, this is the type of data we need. So I don't think we can give a full guideline on that, but maybe for some points we could make some public statement that could be of high interest. I follow you on this point.
And the plagues.
The plagues, well, I think the plagues we are really starting, so we do not know exactly what will come out of what we are doing. But then the plague is not an advice. There is no reason for it to stay as confidential as it is for scientific advice for data that will be generated by the company. Then the data can be sometimes, the situation of plague is so heterogeneous, sometimes like in Italy, the IFA finance registries, and in other countries it will be the company that will have to finance. Sometimes the data will be produced by registries held by learned societies or patients registries. So the situation is very heterogeneous. So it's a bit difficult to say what we are going to be able to make public and in which way. But certainly we will be able to have some information made public, because there is no reason to keep it confidential.
At the back, please.
Germat Sandy, my question is to Hannah. It's very encouraging to hear that you're going to put the patient input into the report. I have some questions about that. Are you going to also describe whether the patient input was used in the decision making, yes or no? And secondly, whether the input had any has any impact on the final decision. The reason being is that you still hear and being questioned whether patient perspective or input is still valuable or not. That's still out in the open if you're being a purist. And my last point is it's more like a logistic point. You still hear cases where patients work very hard to give the input, and they do not know about the decision. They read it on the website. So is there a commitment to also close the information loop that the patient understand in a way the input was gone? But I think the first 2 points are particularly important.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There's no easy yes or no answer, of course. We are currently discussing exactly this, how we can make it best visible, where the patient's input influence, so to speak, this is your question, I understand, the advice. I want to mention that in the different HTA bodies, patients' input is already handled differently and at different stages. For example, at the GBA, it's automatically influencing, as you would put it probably, the advice. So it's directly incorporated there. On the EUnetHTA level, to leverage that is a little bit more complicated, and because of the different agencies already coming with a different input. So all I can tell you now is that we want to make it as transparent as possible. The decision, it's a little bit a complicated issue in itself, I think, because as was mentioned earlier, even though we have on many parts of the advice high agreement between the HTA bodies, we don't come up with a fully, let's say, harmonized advice or decision, in case this is what you were referring to. So in that sense, it's already a little bit difficult to answer your question. But we are now, and maybe Chantal want to add something to that, I don't know. We are now really in the main discussion with the Early Dialogue Working Party also, how to account appropriately for the patient's input. I know it's not a fully satisfactory answer to you, but that's where we are right now. And then in terms of transparency, I understood your question that it was perceived by some patients that they didn't know about what was happening with their contribution. Well, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, because you know, it's like a black box, a lot of effort, and then they don't know what the decision was it used, was it not, and they usually find out through press release, or they have to go to a website. So it is just completing the communication loop to understand what the decision is. But my main question was the first part, the value of patient input into the overall process. That's my main question.
But to also answer maybe parts of your second question, so we conduct interviews with the patients or patient representatives, and then the minutes of the interviews are made available to that respective representative again to review, and they are also being attached to the final report. And now we also started implementing a feedback questionnaire also, and to the patients whether they were satisfied with the process. But you mean a more immediate information?
I think you've answered my question.
Yeah.
So I think
okay,
for today, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe Chantal Guillaume wants to add something.
Actually, you have already answered most of the question. I think it's right that we try to make it as transparent as possible. So we have always, when we have input from patient for early dialogue, I'm talking only, we always have the minute of the discussion we have the patient. We also exchange all the discussion with the patient with all the members of all the HTA bodies who participate in the early dialogue in case the patient is not participating in the face-to-face meeting. So really the input from the patient is taken into account at the time of the recommendation by each HTA bodies. How much it's taken into account, as explained by Anna, it could differ from one agency to another, but we have observed that we always begin the meeting between HTA by giving feedback on the patient, and we always discuss it during a long time, and we see that there are really influence of the feedback from the patient. And to talk about the feedback for the patient, what we do is we always contact the patient at the end of the process to inform him on what was finally the recommendation that was made to the company. And we also ask him about the feedback in terms of his participation and how we can improve, because we are in a phase of where we are testing different approach and it's not final phase, so that's why we also ask this question.
Great, thanks. I think there's a question here in, sorry. Oh, sorry, go ahead. You had to.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. First, the comment builds up on the comment Beate made and also Francois answer on early dialogue. This is a question that has been around for quite a while. There has been a call from many organizations, not only from civil society and patients, but also HT and payers, and there's also an ongoing investigation from the scientific advice on the on this topic. So I think EUnetHTA should take the momentum and increase the transparency, because we all agree. I think that there are some benefits and added value. We would just like to see more transparency for the benefits of everyone, including actually industry. My question to you, Francois, would be on the post-generation collection. I would like to ask what is the main issue that you see, the main barriers, and also according to your national experience, so I would like to hear also the experience of the other panelists. What do you do when this post-generation data collection fails and you're not able to get the data? How do you deal with that?
That will be, the answer will come next year, because for the time being we're just starting, so we are in the hope not to fail, but hope. So for the last part, I take this opportunity to mention part of the team, but Irena Guzina is working on the package 5B from HS, is also in the audience, so you can also bombard her with questions. And so the main issues, I mean, there are many potential issues, of course, because you know we see the difficult, how difficult to coordinate to start at the same time. We are not able to set up the data collection, so the situation is very different. In some countries, the data will come from a patient-owned registry. In another country, it will be the agency that will be responsible for this data collection. In a third country, it could be data collected with the funds coming from the company. So, and how can we share the data? Or not, because of data protection, because of data ownership. So we have a lot of questions. So we have been brave enough to say, despite all these possible limitations, we're going to start and to see what comes out of that, learning by doing, of course. But so the first experiences, the first pilots will be there to define what is possible, to see the limits, and maybe to see what are the possible solutions to overcome these limits. But certainly we will not have something perfect, but at least we will be able to gather some data from various countries. It can be very important where we deal with a rare disease for which the target population, the population is too small in each country to come up with significant conclusions. Then, of course, we have different views on what we can do with observational data and what we can conclude. And can we conclude on the efficacy, effectiveness based on observational data or not? So that will be one of the future challenges we have. So we are lucky enough to have sufficient number of important challenges ahead. But however, we are quite confident that we will achieve something significant.
I'm going to take two last short questions and short answers. Right here in the middle.
Yeah, it's a question to come after the person from IQVIC that sorry, I don't remember the name. Yes, you. And my question here is, I mean, it might be a little bit political, so if you cannot answer, it's fine. It is to understand if there is a possible bridge between the SEEDS project that are currently working, and as you mentioned, industry is very keen to participate, and who is like going really into the joint clinical like the true process of EUnetHTA, because it's maybe naive, but I don't really, I see there is a gap between the seed project and the EUnetHTA, or maybe I'm mistaking, and between doing it. So,
what project are you talking about?
The seeds project.
Seed. I mean, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, that was in the past for the early dialogues.
Yeah, the VP. What you just presented. The word package 5A. Yes, early dialogue. Okay. Yes, exactly. Yeah, the question is that this is working right now, and industry are coming and submitting briefing book. So this is currently already implemented, and right now the European Commission made a proposition with this joint clinical assessment, which is a little bit different. And is there? I mean, there is a little gap, but where is there a bridge between it? That's my question. Also regarding the fact that, yeah.
Yeah, just to, I think maybe within the proposal, it's the early dialogues would be called joint scientific consultations. I should know this, but yeah.
So that's will be the continuation.
It's included, yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's included in the draft regulation. Yes, we have joint assessment and joint scientific consultation. That is the level of early dialogue. So we can have a discussion during the break.
One quick. No, you're good. Okay.
You're good.
That's great.
Ready?
Okay, well, with that, we have a shorter break, but we will reconvene for the last session at the same time, so at 3:45.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in the main hall. We're beginning.
Okay, if I can ask everyone to take a seat, we'll get started for the final session of the day. I see people just sort of milling about outside. Okay, well, I'm sure hopefully they'll join quickly. When I was working with some of you to draft the agenda for today, the feedback was kind of split in terms of some stakeholders were quite keen to discuss the Commission's proposal, whereas others were fairly firm in that they wanted to focus on activities within the current joint action. So understandably, there's been a lot of focus on the future collaboration on HTA in Europe, but EUnetHTA's reaching an important milestone. We're nearing the midpoint of Joint Action 3. So we wanted this to be an open discussion about these final 2 years of Joint Action 3. What is EUnetHTA doing well that it needs to keep doing or even enhance? What's not working and ideally needs to stop? What activity would benefit from maybe a tweak? And what are some things that EUnetHTA currently isn't doing but should consider starting? So before we dive into those questions, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we have quite a large panel, but they have no slides. And so that's probably good. And hopefully, Marcus, you don't fall off the end of the stage there, because we're a little crowded. But okay, so Ancela Santos Quintano is a senior policy advisor with Health Action International, has been with HAI since 2013, and Ancela leads HAI's European work on regulatory issues, the rational use of medicines, and good governance. Ancela holds a bachelor's degree in political science and public administration, a master's in science in international and European politics, as well as a further master's in journalism. I will say, getting all these bios for today is very humbling, so an esteemed group. Valentina Stramiello works as a program manager at the European Patients Forum. Since 2015, she also holds the dossier on HTA. She has represented the patient stakeholder group in EUnetHTA and the HTA network. Since 2016, she's a member of the HTAI Patient and Citizen Interest Group Steering Committee on behalf of EPF. And within EPF, she coordinates the informal working group on HTA involving EPF member representatives. She's contributed to a number of IMI projects, including Adapt Smart, and more recently on Paradigm. Since 2017, Valentina represents EPF and the HTA network stakeholder pool. Daniel Widmer is VP of the European Union of General Practice Practitioners. He's a GP with a practice in Switzerland, and he also lectures at the University of Lausanne in general practice. So he has quite a bit of experience in interprofessional collaboration with other primary care providers, which is quite helpful as he represents the healthcare provider perspective here. Ansgar Heiborn is Roche Pharma's head of global and HTA payment and policy based in Basel, Switzerland. In this role, he focuses on current approaches to HTA, pricing and reimbursement decision-making frameworks, their impact on pharmaceutical innovation and patient access, as well as their future evolution. Ansgar currently represents Roche in relevant industry associations, including being chair of FPA's European HTA Working Group. He's taken a leading role as advisor and stakeholder representative in various HTA collaboration networks, including the HTA Network and EUnetHTA. Flora Giorgio is a pharmacist by training. She's heading the team on HTA at the Commission. The team is responsible for the recently adopted proposal for regulation, which you all would know. And before joining the Commission in I don't know what year, 2006. Yes, Flora worked, that's a typo for me. So Flora was Secretary General of the European Association of Community Pharmacists and also worked in community pharmacy. Marcus Guardian is the Chief Operating Officer for EUnetHTA and has a background in international law, economics, business, and diplomatic studies. Prior to joining ZIN and EUnetHTA, Marcus consulted on crisis and change management, project and stakeholder management, and strategic and investor partnerships. His experience is in various sectors and international settings. So that's your esteemed panel. And the second thing I want to do is to ask just four of the panelists, so the stakeholders, Ansela, Valentina, Daniel, and Ansgar, to share their reflections on this scenario. So I asked them to give this some consideration. I wanted them to, fast forward 2 years. We're at the 2020 EUnetHTA Forum, and I want you to describe your role in EUnetHTA in representing your stakeholder group. How is EUnetHTA optimally engaging with stakeholders at that time? And what does that look like? What does optimal engagement look like to you?
Okay, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to talk here today about EUnetHTA and share our perspectives from the point of view of engaged stakeholders. So Health Action International is a public health NGO, and we bring here the consumer perspective, and we advocate for affordable access to medicines and rational use of medicines. So in this regard, of course, we think that the role of HTA is crucial, not only because it empowers governments and payers when they take their decisions about pricing and reimbursement, but because also it has become a source of information in itself about the question of added therapeutic value for healthcare professionals, patients, and consumers. And at the same time, consumers and patients' views and preferences about treatment and also patients' experiences about the disease is important information for HTA bodies. So always HTA bodies should seek input from patients, consumers, and take it into consideration. But this, of course, has to be done following thorough methods, because at the end of the day, HTA is a science and research-driven process. So at HAI, we have been engaged with the HTA stakeholder pool since the beginning of last year. And obviously with the aim to contribute to discussions about HTA and to the different processes of EUnetHTA as needed. And I have to say that as a newcomer, it has been also a bit difficult sometimes to understand what is expected from us as members of the pool and what's our role and how we can contribute to the different processes established at EUnetHTA. And as we've seen today, also this applies to the broader discussion about patient and consumer engagement. And it seems very much that this depends, the way in which it's done depends very much on the HTA bodies involved in each project and the leader packages. And I think for the sake also of clarity, but also to go ahead and give a step further, it would be good to standardize a bit more these procedures on patient and consumer engagement. And it's good to see that there are already reflection processes ongoing, and we will definitely submit some comments to the stakeholder analysis reflection paper that has been circulated to us by Work Package 2. And I really like one of the proposals made in there to have specific frameworks of interaction per category of stakeholder. And I think we definitely should have a framework of interaction between EUnetHTA and patients and consumers, which looks at, okay, taking into account the whole process of HTA from the very beginning, like including development of scientific guidelines and scientific advice, to then the assessments, but also down the line, communication materials also, like how can we best engage patients and consumers in all these processes, and what different procedures should apply, which methods, and what can our role be as members of the pool and patient and consumer organizations in helping and reaching out to patients and consumers to engage in the process. One question for us, well, I want to say, while I think this framework of interaction, I understand that it cannot address everything. Maybe we can talk about some principles and then go further in detail and develop other frameworks as needed. I think one of the questions that could be interesting to discuss more in detail is the concrete methods, also how to best capture patients and consumers' input, how to ensure representativeness, because obviously not all patients think the same, not all consumers think the same, and sometimes the approaches between patients and consumers itself is different. So we have to make sure that we also have representative samples when we consult with stakeholders. And definitely one of the questions that for us is very important when we talk about stakeholder engagement is the question also of conflicts of interest. And it is my understanding that there's now a discussion and that the plan is to have a more, let's say, a common approach. EUnetHTA-wise, for us it's important to see that at the end of the day there's a robust policy in place, and also we wouldn't like to see that those agencies that have stricter policies that are being asked to flexibilize their policies, because for us this would send a wrong signal about the direction in which we are going. I think we should be learning from best practices, and EUnetHTA should be about that. And then maybe there are other things that we can discuss at the end, but one other point that I would make, that it would be really good to improve also the communications directly between the members of the stakeholder pool, and I'm referring about patients, consumers in this case, and directly EUnetHTA, because there are a number of things that are very project specific, and that it doesn't make that much sense to discuss with the HTA network, but more with directly the work packages and the leaders of the work packages. So I think we have to also see how we can improve the direct communications between the pool and EUnetHTA.
Thank you, Ansela. So again, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. EPF, as maybe of you know, maybe, is an umbrella organization representing all patients across Europe and across diseases. Then I will go directly to the point. I thought I should go back to 2015, actually, because it's when, together with BEUC, EURORDIS, and the European Multiple Sclerosis Platform, we have submitted a very constructive proposal to the Consortium of Joint Action 3. And our idea was, and still is, that we should be constructively and regularly involved, which means providing a supportive role to EUnetHTA to make sure that patients and consumers are meaningfully involved in the process. And we can also help by setting up the framework for the evaluation of patients and consumers' input. What we can also do is contributing to the design and structures and procedures in place for the involvement of patients. We see this as very critical to a potential future EU collaboration on HTA. Last but not least, we see as a key priority the possibility for patients and consumers to play a role in the topic prioritization, because we have a lot to share. We have the direct experience of the users and patients having access to the healthcare services, healthcare technologies, and therefore we think that we should have a voice there. I would add the last point, maybe this is too visionary, but it's what I would like to see in 2020. I would like to see us as fully integrated in the decision-making process within EUnetHTA. So since the co-design phase till the adoption, which means co-design, review, validation, and adoption. Otherwise, I don't think that random contribution or consultation is really meaningful. Thank you.
I will try to give you a short input from all the healthcare providers group, not only as a GP as I am, but for all the group. We have a triple position facing EUnetHTA or facing HTA. We are certainly stakeholders. But if we take the definition of EUnetHTA, a stakeholder is a person who is willing to be actively involved. And for us, it is not only a question of will. As healthcare providers, we are also defined by European law. I can take the definition of health professional, the definition of healthcare provider. Those definitions are in the directive on professional qualifications. And there is also the definition in the directive about cross-border care. And also this directive of cross-border care is defining the role of the healthcare providers. The healthcare providers provide relevant information to help individual patients to make an informed choice, including on treatment option, on the availability, quality, and safety of the healthcare they provide. As you see, this important statement show us that the law want to define the interaction between the healthcare provider and the patient with the underlying value of communication between both. This implies the creation of an associative level to or of space or bodies, including patient and healthcare providers. As an example, I can give you is the last meeting of the European Forum of Primary Care, whose title was "The Citizen Voice in Primary Care: A Social Commitment for Health for the Future," and for all. If you want innovation and new technology are implying more information about potential effects, more communication, and more attention to relationship. And the third point is that we are also experts. In our group, there are certainly some people that belongs to academia and to research, but we consider them, those groups of academic and researchers, included, not a separate entity from our group. Even if in our association there are some group, as my own group, who are more political than academic, we consider that academic research and scientific evidence is the basic dimension of our action. And the role of research and academia is to provide and appraise scientific evidence. Academia and research should also be actively involved in the process of scoping early dialogues, appraisal of new technology, as well as in generating new independent evidence in the development phase and after the technology reaches the market. This role of academic research is also important, and I insist on this point, to harmonize in Europe the different guidelines used by doctors. It's not possible to have one guideline in UK, one guideline in Germany, and it is a big trouble for us. If we can have some guidelines that are more harmonized, it's a good thing. Our role is also to rely on our clinical experience. We are also experts of clinical practice, and it's defined in the revised framework for interaction between EMA and healthcare professional. This role is to give the best possible independent expertise in clinical practice to incorporate the real-world experience into drug development and so on, benefit risk evaluation and monitoring. All organizations of our group of healthcare provider group having members in direct contact with patients are ready to share this clinical expertise. In routine practice, we can further rely on our experience in the contact with patients, for example, for pharmacovigilance, for promotion of adherence to therapies, quality management, traceability and promotion of rational and appropriate use of medicine. We can also inform as a healthcare professional trial design on the needs, on the wishes and preference of our patients. For conclusion, we hope that EUnetHTA, as EMA, will recognize the different role of healthcare professionals as clinical investigators, academic researchers, prescribers, handlers, safety guardians. It is a quotation of the text of EMA, communicators with an active role in different stages of medicines or health technology life cycle, including horizon scanning, topic selection for potentially disruptive innovation. You know, healthcare providers can also imagine the future. Not only other person. We are not a person who are conservative. We can imagine the future, and we can contribute to various ways to the patient journey within the healthcare system. Thank you.
Okay, HTA is not happening in a vacuum, and I think Daniel described it very well, that it's important to understand the clinical context in which assessments take place. And stakeholders, I think like industry, others here on the panel, they are important means to bring this context in which healthcare, patient care decisions take place to the table of HTA. I think we heard a lot about transparency, so for us it will be important to have a transparent and systematic process, framework, that engages all stakeholders in all activities of EUnetHTA. This is certainly an important step, and I think we've made relevant steps for product-specific activity, but it also goes beyond. It goes to activities where people talk about and establish ultimately guidelines and other aspects. Transparency means that there is an opportunity to be consulted. I think we are not co-authors of the guidance or the SOPs that we heard this morning about, but certainly there is an opportunity to comment on those. Also for EUnetHTA to understand the implications of what you do or of what your assessments may do later on. I think I mentioned this before, and we heard a lot about this in the prior session. I think for us it's important to build expectations about how our future, our products in the future will be assessed. And the critical step here is that we have predictable access to the parallel EMA or EUnetHTA scientific advice framework that has been established and will be further established and become a very normal, accessible process in the next 2 years, certainly, I hope. I think it's important that there are sustainable resources put into this process. I think I've heard Sabine Wiesler before. There is room to do this in an efficient manner and to find ways to create guidelines that go above an individual product assessment. But it's very important for us to plan for future HTA as an industry stakeholder of EUnetHTA. I think for us it's important that EUnetHTA, and this has to do with a strong stakeholder understanding of stakeholder interests, which are not only industry but others, payers and so on. It's important that EUnetHTA introduces projects only then when there is a clear defined use case for them. I think rather than discovering that they may be used later on, start from the use, start from the request and decide then how to engage the resources. I hope that we have been able and will have been able to use the resources, the remaining resources for this joint action flexibly going forward to prepare for the future. We may discover that certain initiatives are not worth the effort just because they are on the plan. I think we need to think about what is really relevant for the future, in particular because there is a stakeholder that uses the outputs. And I think it's important, given that use is so important for us, it's important to jointly try to understand what are these barriers for effective use. It could be the barriers in an industry as a stakeholder, as someone who participates in a joint assessment, but it's also the barriers for use in countries. I think in the end, we should do pilots that focus specifically on the use. I hope that with these initiatives and with a more systematic and very transparent involvement of stakeholders, we've established trust, relevant trust between all the participants, not just between the industry and EUnetHTA or industry and other stakeholders, but also between the HTA agencies in EUnetHTA. I think sometimes when you get closer to these discussions, I think there is also a lack of trust that I think we have to overcome in the next 2 years between HTA agencies. We have a quality discussion, and there are certain other elements that are important to build the trust between stakeholders and EUnetHTA that's needed going forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think I heard a number of common points there. Flora and Marcus, I'm not forgetting about you. You're going to have an opportunity to reflect on what you heard. But I'll just sort of summarize a little bit what I heard, because I think it's pretty consistent around that something a little bit, the engagement would be more structured, even mention of frameworks and existing frameworks referenced, and expectations made clear. And so I think that, and that has been feedback that EUnetHTA has received around that the engagement has been more ad hoc and sort of slow to start. So I think, and then there's specific examples in terms of which we can dive into a little bit in a few minutes about opportunities to engage further. But I think it was around, being clear in terms of the expectations of how and when stakeholders would be involved, and that would be all stakeholders, and follow through with that in a predictable way. First, maybe I'll sort of turn it over to Marcus in terms of reflecting on what you heard. I also heard a few things that I know, just in discussing with you before, kind of about this session, made you twitch a little bit in terms of what can change given what's been already committed. How much flexibility is there in terms of what's been planned and how resources are allocated, and in terms of what's the opportunity to shift a little bit in terms of what EUnetHTA is doing now?
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for your very insightful comments in terms of what you would like to have. And on a very broad level, I would like to say yes to all of you, because I think we need that engagement, we want that input. Obviously, there are limitations to that. So the time limitation is we are a project-based situation right now. So we have funding that has been allocated in 2015 very specifically. So that is one of the limitations we live with. One other is that we simply have to see that we use all our resources till 2020 for those allocated deliverables, and in a way that we cannot predict what happens after. So if we look in the situation 2020, I would love to be in a situation where I can say, in the last 2 years, we have been engaging with you constructively on various levels, and I would love to see that we find not maybe boxes, because I mean the term stakeholders seems rather overwhelming given the diversity of actors in that box, and I would rather see a structured approach but an organic approach as well. So organic in the term of we see in our procedures openings where we believe input from specific stakeholders would be extremely beneficial for both sides, but maybe not from every stakeholder group. So I think here we need to be flexible and see how we can reach out best and find engagements with all partners. I think expectation and expectation management is something we really have to improve, and this is, I mean, one of the reasons why we increased our engagement dramatically and tried to find different avenues to reach out to our partners, not only present here on the panel, but others that we have strong contact with. And we hope to learn from there. But we always have to say what our overarching aim is. We want to create a sustainable system not for the next 2 years. We want to create a sustainable system for a system post-2020. And in creating that, we try to find a mechanism that will allow us to do this with the minimal resources we might have available in a post-2020 scenario. So working with scarcity on one hand, but trying to be as inclusive as possible.
Great, thanks. And Flora, certainly you're open to any reflections on what you heard, but maybe if I can also get you to comment a bit. I mean, this HTA network stakeholder pool was referenced, and certainly there's a stakeholder group referenced in the proposal. And, I'm just sort of, one of the points was, better linkage, I guess, from the pool to EUnetHTA. And certainly the way that EUnetHTA engages with stakeholders in Joint Action 3 is different than it was in Joint Action 2. And I think we've been trying to leverage the pool in some ways, maybe not optimally. I think it's more been recently trying to do that. But what do you see, at least in terms of the evolution or use of the pool, or engagement of the pool over the next couple years? And do you see that evolving into what has been proposed?
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for asking the question and for inviting here and giving us the possibility to reflect a bit. And I think this is really about reflection and try to find solution in a rather short term, because what we would really like to get from EUnetHTA in the next 2 years, it's really the key, maybe the key principle in relation to the involvement of stakeholders in the different, in the overall cooperation, but also in the different process and procedure. Because one thing is, you cannot just say involve stakeholders in the cooperation. Marcus and others made the point, stakeholders have different perspective, different expertise, and as such, they may provide different input at different time for different joint output. So what we have tried to do in the proposal, we have tried to create some hooks that then obviously have to be further worked upon and developed. And we didn't have the ambitions to find the best, the best way forward. I think EUnetHTA should find the best way forward. EUnetHTA, in testing the different approach, should really hopefully help us to shape how this can be done in the most effective and efficient and meaningful way. One of the elements, however, that we have tried to sketch out already in the proposal, it's really that there are 2 different levels where we believe the specificity of stakeholders have to be reflected in the cooperation. On one hand is when you really develop a joint assessment or a joint work that could be product specific, so a joint clinical assessment, a joint scientific consultation. In that workflow, we believe it's very important looking at the best practice in the different member states to make sure that the input of patient expert, of clinical expert, of specific categories of stakeholders is taken into account, is built in the process. And that's what we have tried to do in this Article 6, where you have some reference to the fact that, when there is a product-specific assessment done, you need to get the relevant expertise. Now, we have limited that to patient and clinical expert because we believe, for instance, industry is in a different position in that specific development because they are, as a partie intéressée, if I can say so. They are
as well.
Patient as well, but with different, exactly, but with different, how can I say, with different. Everybody is, and that's why we have, but the industry is submitting, from our the industry is giving the first element, and they should be as well consulted in the process, but in a different way than you consult the patient, the clinical professional, whatever. And so, and I believe it's important to or maybe accept or challenge this principle. From our perspective, we felt there is a way and the modality to involve in the development of the joint work. And then there is a more horizontal engagement in other activities which are more probably under the remit of what we call the stakeholder network, which I think we should also think of a new stakeholder network. Everybody, of course, it's always, we always compare to what we have now in the EUnetHTA network, what we had now in the forum. I think that, and that's the challenge for all of us, we should try to design the best possible stakeholder network that meets the needs of everybody. We believe the stakeholder network should be the ones that is more involved on the horizontal topic and the work program definition. Earlier this morning we heard about the key input they could provide in the horizon scanning exercise, in guidance document, methodological document. I think that's a different type of input where you involve also representative organization. But again, I think also there, what the point which were made by several of you, and we can only support it, is that the engagement has to be structured, predictable, and consistent. Because unfortunately, and this is one of the lessons we learn from the current model of cooperation, and it's not a criticism, it's simply a fact. Today, it depends a bit of who is doing what, because you, of course, follow your national practice and what you are used to do at home. And I think that's where we have a major opportunity with the possible European framework, where you can try to have a more consistent and predictable approach, which we fully agree should not go and lower the standards of the one that get the good practice, but rather on the other direction. And I think, you know, EUnetHTA is really a key role in our view in this next, I mean, it's always had, but also in the next 2 years, to really focus maybe how much can we achieve in the next 2 years. Maybe set out some general principle on patient, professional, stakeholders, you know, involvement in terms of for product-specific development, and maybe develop some kind of process on when and how, at which stage the clinical expert or the patient should be involved in the product development output, and then more general principle on, you know, what this stakeholder network, for instance, could provide. I think already recognize that there is a different level of involvement in types of activity would be very important, and then maybe have even some very more specific guidance on output-specific joint clinical assessment, on joint scientific consultation, which are being tested today. I think for us would be a great advantage to have it in 2020, when hopefully, maybe, we will have a European framework on a more sustainable base to really address also the shortcoming of the current model, which also affect, and I think that's a fact, the engagement of the stakeholders in the process. So, I mean, I don't know if I have actually answered the question, but I just reflected on some of the points.
Ansgar, I think you wanted to.
It's very concrete. So is this a dedicated project in EUnetHTA going forward to have a stakeholder framework that we could then discuss? I think that's one of the challenges. We have a very open discussion here, which is appreciated. But as you say, it depends very much on what project is on the table, how stakeholders are involved. And I think it would make it easier if we made it a specific project, or you, with resources, and we may have to shift some resources, or you have to shift some resources, but to have something very concrete, to have defined where stakeholders are involved and where not, because that's important. It's very important to build trust in national agencies going forward or in the stakeholder audiences. Is it resourced?
Resource question's my favorite. Actually, the person with the pearl strings sits next to me, so I'm only the caretaker of it. But the answer is, right now we reach out very individually to the individual stakeholder groups, and we walk through an exercise. So what we do is we sit together with them. We look at our processes, our templates, our procedures, and try to identify with them where are time points, where are interactions relevant for them and for us. And we take this as a starting point. This is our exercise right now, especially in view of what is upcoming after 2020. We simply do not have resources in terms of allowing to create a new network that would allow regular meetings, that would allow vast amounts of travel. However, with the limited resources, we very actively reach out, and we very actively try to engage in the individual working packages. So we try to instill in the individual working packages also the sense of importance, and the lead partners are very actively involved in these procedures where we try to find an overarching approach. How do we deal and engage with stakeholders, but also broken down what is relevant for them in the individual working packages. So we try to get out of the silos, yes, on an overarching level, but we have to live also with the specificities of the individual projects.
Just, I wanted to come back to something that Flora mentioned. I totally agree that when we think about patient and consumer engagement, then we have to differentiate situations in which it makes more sense to engage the representative of the organization or the expert patient and consumer, or really the lay patient. So I think that's something that could be addressed within like the framework of interaction. And then transparency, I agree. I think the interactions have to be transparent, well structured. I think there's and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's, I think, the plan to explore the idea of setting up like a database of stakeholders. And I think it would be good to have a public interface and see also a list of experts that are engaged and the declarations of interest as well. I think this is something that, an idea that we should move forward. Yeah.
I'd like to respond to Marcus about the issue of time limitation. I wouldn't see as the key challenge. I mean, we should always find a way to overcome these kind of problems. The problem in EUnetHTA, to my view, and I don't want to criticize, but the problem is that we have never thought of structuring standardized involvement for patients. And that's why every time we are involved to contribute and identify someone, we try to do it, but it's always very hectic because there's no standard to follow. And I would start from there, try to sit together and find what's the best way to go in that direction. But, and another point would be, we know that some patients have been already involved in assessments, and my request here is to really see what has been done and try to see how it can be improved, whether it needs to be improved or not, because otherwise we keep talking and there's no action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I welcome that. And criticism I'm welcoming as well, as long as it's constructive, but yes, please criticize. I fully agree. So what we do right now is, even though I disagree with Ansgar when he calls our joint assessments pilots, I'm not entirely there with you. Parts of them we do piloting, and part of that is actually our engagement with stakeholders. And we try now exactly that. We try to find different approaches, and we try to see which is appropriate or not in which situation. And we very welcome the feedback we receive from the individual organizations that partake in our joint assessment. So after each joint assessment, we send out specific queries to get that feedback. And for us, it's extremely helpful also from stakeholder groups. But as I mentioned before, we do realize we want to intensify that dialogue with the hope of developing a more structured approach. But again, I believe also given the great variety of products that are out there, we need to have some flexibility in what we do.
For the creation of such an horizontal engagement group, I don't think it can be so expensive or difficult. The question is the question of trust, as you said, Ansgar, with the creation of a good trust between participants. And it's perhaps useful to begin with a small group and about specific topics, and to put on the table all the questioning we have between stakeholders. The industry is interested, the doctors are too much apostolic, the patients are too much consumers, and we have all some ideas about each other's. I think to create trust, we must put on the table all these failed ideas, and after that we can work. I have the experience of that at the small is beautiful at the level of the university. It's possible to create, even we had a small group, for example, also between doctors, when we are working, we had the idea to work about a new technology about personalized medicine with genetician, and a colleague genetician said, "Oh, you have GPs in your group? It's impossible. GPs are too reactive and too opposite of all." And we have all preconceptions about each other, and we must begin with small groups, I think so, not with a big organization.
Yes, maybe some suggestion, because I think it's also very important to really stay pragmatic. I think work package 4 and 5 as well are really trying to test the different possibility. And I think maybe, and EUnetHTA has their SOP for developing a joint clinical assessment or an early, how you get to an early dialogue. And so would be actually very easy for also for the stakeholders organization to look at that and see at which stage they believe they could be involved. And I think then there needs to be a pragmatic approach and a proportionate approach, because of course it's great to have the involvement of as many as possible. More point of views are reflected in a joint report, and the better it is. But then it's also consequence on the target, on the timing, on the quality, on the feasibility, and on the resources, especially in a, I not call it piloting, in a testing phase, let's say, in a further validation phase, if I could say. But I think, you know, I really try to call for being specific, because it's also from the stakeholders organization. I mean, you want to say when you want to be involved in the joint clinical assessment. Well, I'm now using the proposal language, but I should use probably the EUnetHTA language. In the early dialogue, in the joint REA, when you have the SOP of EUnetHTA, at which stage do you think your expert can be involved? And I think that's, it's not such a resource-consuming exercise. Another point I wanted to make, that we also should not forget we have still this, I mean, we have the HTA network that is under and here I'm making a kind of, not an offer, but in the HTA network work program, there is a strand of activities involving of stakeholders in that. So if it's about having or funding a meeting or a working group between a number of stakeholder organizations and a number of EUnetHTA partners, I mean, we could probably help if it's a matter of funding a meeting. I mean, we have planned activities under that strand of the HTA network, which we could support. And if that can help to really get more concrete suggestion on how you make the involvement in the different output, I mean, I don't think, you know, it's not something that it's a couple of meetings with the right expertise and the committed people cannot be done. And I think we have this, both from the stakeholders' perspective and in the EUnetHTA, you know, the EUnetHTA leaders that are really working in this development. So I think that's also something we can explore. And on the point, Angela, you touched on the idea of setting up a database. I mean, I think what we put in the proposal is that, you know, there needs to be a mechanism, and we also refer to maybe this stakeholder network as the pool that could suggest this clinical or patient expert. I think we have in the preparatory phase, and still now we are very closely also discussing with the colleague in EMA. They have a process and you know, tools in place, and we don't think we should repeat, but we should really learn from what is happening in other sectors. So that could be an option. Is there a room maybe for using what is already developed? And that these are all things that, again, the proposal is not specific, but maybe EUnetHTA can already start seeing whether is there a room maybe to use, or is a possibility to use the EMA tools for identifying, you know, experts and for patient and consumer. Again, we had also quite a very interesting and fruitful discussion in, I think it was September, where this point was actually discussed between patient representative and EMA and ourselves, and I think that's something, and EUnetHTA, and I think that's something that should continue. But we are in a critical phase where we should really try to focus on a number of maybe small but concrete ideas that can be brought forward.
Yeah, I was referring more to the paper about stakeholder analysis that's being produced by Work Package. So we have some people, I don't know where they are, but I think that there was their reference about like a registry. It's like an idea, right? So I'm just thinking, yeah, okay, building on what we have now and what the ongoing discussion, so taking them, yeah, a step further.
So is there then a very concrete project so that we can be not pragmatic or bold or going too far with our requests? I think it would help if we had something on the table, or can clearly put things on the table in a project so that you can say you're not pragmatic. But I think right now we are operating a little bit into the blue, where were we invited to make a proposal, a very concrete proposal? Have I missed it, or?
I would like to say there's a standing invitation. Having said that, I like that, and maybe we should do that. I'm personally not the most convinced person when it comes to creating groups. I do not necessarily believe that groups as such are extremely efficient. However, if it means collaboration together on a topic, on a specific topic, I'm more than welcome. And having heard that the Commission so graciously just opened the purse, I would love to review some of our activities in terms of if we can find time and space together with stakeholders present here, but also in the audience and beyond that. But there, I would really also like to manage expectation, because this is something we discussed earlier. We would really need to understand beforehand what are the expectations and from stakeholders, and that includes for us also what exactly will you do with the information you get? What exactly do you want to influence and things like that? So the dialogue goes beyond that for us, and with these premises, I would like to extend an invitation, but first I would need to get the okay from my executive board before I'm reaching out too far here. But I'm looking at the chair who's currently texting, so I think that's that will be fine.
Thanks, Marcus. I'll sort of share the approach that was taken with the patient and consumer organizations, where I don't think I think proactively organizations sent in a proposal, and EUnetHTA was work package 4 and 5, sort of drafted something where what they thought would be feasible, and had patient and consumer organizations reflect on this. And from my perspective, I thought that approach went well, but I think it would be helpful to hear would something like that work for other stakeholder groups? Did you find that approach too restrictive? Were you not feeling like you could shape that? Was it a good start? So it would be helpful to hear from and others who were at the meeting as well.
I think it was a good start, but I think also it's an unfinished work. So we cannot limit it to a one-day meeting with a follow-up minutes report. I think there should be more continuous and regular engagement. That's why I'm a bit concerned, because to me, I don't want to say that it's a waste of time, that what you have done at the end of January. I think it was very useful to get in touch with work package leaders and also get an understanding of their concerns, their needs. I think we need more of these kind of meetings. One is not enough. And we need to get to understand each other a bit more, because we all have concerns, but I don't want to stay with my concern and leave the room with no solutions.
Okay, Marcus?
Since we want to make it a bit more concrete, maybe, and I'm looking over to my head of Work Package 4 co-lead partner, but maybe we could envision that we actually, take the SOPs for joint assessments and take that as a test case and see in a dialogue where can we start. You could have a look at it. So I'm seeing no violent heading or not nodding either, but but I think if either this or in any other topic, but I think what I'm trying to say is we could find one concrete example where you feel that we can work on it and take it as a test case, and then start from there. Meaning that we want to reach out to show that we want to engage, and we cannot engage on all topics at once. That's just not feasible for us.
I fully agree. I think this is really what I had in mind, kind of a pilot where we can test how we can work together and identify challenges and possible solutions. I think it's the only way forward. I mean, I don't see any other solutions. And maybe if we start doing it now, by 2020, we have in place, I don't want to use the term structure because it's not flexible enough, but a framework to support our involvement.
And I think maybe if it addresses the idea of the predictability and the consistency. So I did notice some opposition to your comment, and I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I don't know whether it was related to the consultation on a particular aspect. Maybe it was the SOPs, but I think another idea that was brought up was just looking at the procedure and indicating, ideas of where stakeholders may be involved, and sort of taking that input. And I don't know, Beata, if you want to comment. You had a visceral response, so I might have to give you the opportunity. And I asked just because certainly SOPs are developed by Work Package 6.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Well, I think, SOPs are just description of processes of our internal work. I think the better just format for this consultation, which definitely would be helpful, is more of a kind of overview of the process. So a process description, and then go into identify which are actually the steps within this process where the involvement makes sense and is feasible. I think if we would have a better identification of these steps, and I feel that is what Marcus meant, that could be helpful to start off from there, to define then exactly how to kind of organize this involvement. Yeah, well, but I understood we are talking about identifying the points in the process where involvement would make sense. That is, I thought, what we are talking about.
There's a question just behind you.
It's more to react to what you were saying, Flora. You mentioned the idea of more like sharing knowledge. Oh, you are talking. Oh, okay, sorry, I'm tired. Okay, you were talking about the idea about sharing knowledge, and regarding this cooperation, would it be possible to maybe accumulate knowledge that has potentially been done in other sectors than the pharmaceutical industry, like other cooperation between member states, or like, I don't know what could be comparable in another sector, but another type of cooperation, because I assume that it's something that should happen in other sectors, and since you are sitting at the DG in the Commission Européenne, I don't know.
I think when we, in the Commission is quite a lot of experience in try to facilitate stakeholder engagement, and even there we are probably not there yet. And I think in the development of this text, we have really looked a lot at what happened in the pharmaceutical sector on the regulatory side and in the national countries in HTAs. Of course, if we haven't identified any other sector that we looked as a model which could maybe fit for us, because we believe we have good practice within the sector already in the countries and in the European framework of cooperation. And that's why we came up with this idea of a more, product-specific input and more horizontal input, and create, representative bodies or a framework or a pool of organization that could regularly be engaged in a number of activities. I think that's a framework that has to be developed. EMA took 20 years to develop it, I think. I think it's fair enough to say as well. We should not take 20 years, because we should learn from what has happened, and we got already 20 years of cooperation behind us, just to remind. So I think we are in a much more favorable position, but still we have really to get, but my point is we have really to be at this stage, I believe, concrete. And that's why I think this idea of maybe sharing the process workflow and at which point from the stakeholder perspective, with their different expertise, where they believe they should get involved and which type of input they can offer, I think it's fair enough to say that HTA bodies should not be forced to say yes to everything, because it's but I think it would be very useful, I think, for EUnetHTA, for us, and for probably, hopefully, also for everybody that are, involved, that there are concrete suggestions. This is the process to come to an early dialogue report, or this is the process that we follow to develop a joint REA, where we would like to provide expertise and which kind of input we can provide, and then there is a discussion on how this can be brought forward. And if it's about conveying a couple of meetings to facilitate this, I'm sure we can help in that.
Okay. I have a question related to stakeholders, or also a comment. When you talk about stakeholders, they have different stakes, and they may be of quite a different size, and so it may be, this should also be taken into account, and also on what stages of the process they should be involved. But what's quite unclear to me, it was just presented to us, the EU proposal for a joint HTA. Which role is left for EUnetHTA then? And we are talking here about how stakeholders could be involved here, but it's not clear to me, and maybe the Commission can clarify that, in the legislative proposal, there's also, as you have also presented, there's also stakeholders' involvement planned, but that is very unspecified at the time being. That would be something different than happens here. Could you clarify that, maybe?
Unfortunately, I don't have the full answer, and that's why it's not so specific in the proposal, exactly because of the discussion we are having here. Again, the proposal sets out the framework for post-2020, 2023 scenario, where fortunately or unfortunately, we believe EUnetHTA will not exist anymore. EUnetHTA is a project that has a formal contract end in May 2020, maybe extended for a few months, but at some point will end. And what we are setting up now with the proposal is the sustainability section. Is the fact it's the post-EUnetHTA, and to bring all the good elements of EUnetHTA and all the limitations that EUnetHTA demonstrate to a next level, address them, and actually create a framework which would actually make a step ahead of what EUnetHTA can deliver today because of the way that the system is designed. And I think that's why the input needs to come from EUnetHTA now. And that's why I believe things like identify at which step of the process the different expertise shall be sought and identified, it's important. So EUnetHTA is feeding into the future framework, and the future framework is meant to bring EUnetHTA to the next level. And the stakeholder involvement is an area where we have identified, we have put there the tools, but we have not been very specific, fair enough. And I think maybe there is still room in the next months to be more specific if the issue was raised in the co-legislative process. But I still believe there will be more to actually that needs to come from the validation, not piloting phase that is happening in EUnetHTA.
And if I could just add too, I think what we heard as well, Flora, was that it's not only about being a feeder for the future, but it's lacking now. So I think this becomes a useful, a necessary activity at this point. We have two questions. I think someone has a microphone here. Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to come back to the request for have more stakeholder engagement, and I wanted to remind that the recommendations of the TISP task group and also the patient and healthcare provider task groups, which are led by Work Package 4, will be open for consultation in the coming months. I think this is a good opportunity for commenting on the recommendations for this involvement. And these recommendations will then feed into the related SOPs. And I think this process would be much more appropriate than giving all the EUnetHTA SOPs which are now under development and will be subject to further evaluation and revisions to make them up for the general public. And what was repeatedly requested was this transparency. And of course, transparency is one of the major goals of HTA, but I think another is also independence. And yeah, I think we have to find an optimal trade-off between these different requirements. And just to be transparent with regard to everything would not necessarily lead to building more trust and credibility in our work. So yeah, I think we have to find the right proportions for this.
I think Menno next.
Menno Arnoud, I work for AIM, one of the important stakeholders, maybe the most important stakeholder in the field of HTA, the ultimate end user of HTA assessments. I would like to support the message brought by Valentina of EPF, and I agree with Flora's suggestion in principle to invite stakeholders to show or to indicate in which part of the process they see a role and how they can contribute. But I think that for most stakeholders that has already been done in much detail, and we have indicated to EUnetHTA where we think that we can contribute. So I really think it's up to EUnetHTA to indicate in the process where they think that stakeholders can be contributing, and not continue with broad statements of involvement of stakeholders is important, but to say, no, we don't want all stakeholders to be involved in everything, but we think, because we know what HTA is about, we are HTA agencies, we know where we think, we know where stakeholders can contribute to the process. And then, so I think that it's time for EUnetHTA to identify specifically where they want our contribution, and we are very happy to do so.
Maybe I'll have others reflect on that. It's a suggestion, just to follow up, that EUnetHTA would indicate that, which then you could validate or support or not. So, okay. Any comments from other? I mean, I would say that I don't know whether all stakeholders. I would say that not all stakeholders may feel the same way that they've had this opportunity to identify where they want to be involved. Chantal, I see you.
Yes, thank you. I think that certainly we should organize consultation when we are going to propose, for instance, a new process. And I would propose to start with the one that I've announced this morning, which is the process of early dialogue for medical devices that we can make available for consultation for a short time, because we would like to launch it very, very, very rapidly. And the second thing that we can do also in terms of transparency is we are today within the WP5 trying to make an analysis of the feedback from the stakeholders who has been involved in the early dialogues. Industry, patients, and also HTA bodies. And we would like to publish this analysis. So that's maybe something that, in terms of transparency, first examples, I do agree that we need to better communicate on what we are doing.
Any other questions or comments? There's one at the very back. Could we get a microphone at the very back corner?
Thank you. Margaret Boers from Erasmus University. I'm not a stakeholder. I'm just a researcher observing a little bit the whole process of European cooperation in HTA. And we're talking now about stakeholder engagement, which is a topic which is there already probably for 10 years at least. But we're also talking about the regulation and the adoption of the regulation, and maybe I can say that the countdown is already being engaged with 2020 coming nearby, and as was indicated, if the regulation is not adopted as such, it will be the end of joint actions as they exist and the financing of these initiatives. Now, my question is actually how important is the stakeholder engagement in the current discussions on member state level and in the European Parliament on this regulation? And what other issues are actually critical at this moment? The subsidiarity principle has been notified by several countries. I don't know if Flora maybe can say something about it, because in a sense it's, I think, also important to know what the chances are for these regulations to pass.
Thank you for the question. As I try to, as I said after lunch, I think the regulation is on the table. It's on the co-legislative process. As in every legislative process, there are some concerns. The whole objective of the co-legislation is that a proposal which is put forward is changed, amended, improved, and hopefully adopted. It's not a given, as I said. There are challenges. Important concerns have been raised by some national parliaments on subsidiarity issues and on, mainly subsidiarity issue. The Commission, according to the procedure, is responding to these concerns. We don't believe there are subsidiarity issues. Otherwise, we could have not proposed it. We believe our proposal is proportionate and it is proportionate for the reason that I mentioned earlier, that the focus is on clinical assessment. There are a lot of safeguards in terms of decision-making process and division of competence. However, of course, these are concerns. These are on the table, and we can only wait what is the position that the different governments and the co-legislator in the Parliament will take in the coming months. So we have made our proposal. We have made all the preparation which we felt was necessary to come up with at least an informed proposal. Then, obviously not the perfect one, because, but that's the idea of the process. There is one proposal for one party, and the others have to discuss it, changes, and hopefully, again, consider it important enough to adopt it. If then it's considered politically not important enough to be adopted, then of course we need to draw the consequence, and that's what I said earlier. If there won't be any regulation after 2020 in place, then the situation is EUnetHTA finishes, and that's it. We cannot commit to continue a cooperation when we have made a proposal on a legislative process, and if the proposal is not accepted, it will be challenging to continue to support cooperation on an area where politically probably was not considered important enough. So I think that's the last point on how important is the stakeholder engagement in the whole co-legislative process. I think it is an important element. I think the Parliament is already recognized, and I think every HTA bodies recognize it. It is an important element in their national decision-making process, and that's why we wanted to reflect it in the proposal. And so, to be very frank, I don't think will be the killing element if it's not for the member states, but it is an important dimension of the process, which is being looked at with a lot of interest from the different co-legislator and, of course, stakeholders, including ourselves.
I'll take maybe one last question from the audience and then ask for any closing remarks by any of the panelists, if you have any.
to follow on what you just said, in the unfortunate event that the proposition might not happen, does it mean that all what we discussed previously with the like what was presented the session before, meaning the early dialogues and then the other working group, would be over and bring to an end, even if it has a lot of success right now? Thank you.
It's a nice Friday afternoon session. As you may know, there is a discussion currently on the multi-annual financial framework to agree on also on the budget of the EU budget for the next years. And of course, you know, supporting initiatives, it's a key area, and which sector should continue to receive EU budget in an area, you know, in a moment where you have a reduction of the number of member states and you have financial constraint for everybody. I cannot really answer the question. I can only put the facts on the table and see if there is no legal framework post-2020, a new commission and a new parliament will need to decide whether there is enough background to actually continue to fund this area of cooperation. You said it yourself. It's a pity because many of these areas show great success and a lot of potential for further development for everybody, and I think it's everybody around this table and in this room, and we even had the 100%, for 3 seconds we had 100% of respondents that believe that the cooperation should continue, but if the proposal doesn't go through, it's challenging.
Marcus, I think you wanted to come in.
I'm not sure if I have bells and whistles to chair now. I just wanted to say that there's the European Commission that is funding this project, but I have to take now the EUnetHTA hat, which I'm representing here, and 40% at least is coming from member states. The question, however, is, and this is an answer nobody in this room or beyond that can answer, is if member states will be willing to take up the tab, basically. So this is a question that is out there. We do hope and believe that the regulation will find its way through the very meandrous ways of the EU decision-finding processes, and that in the end we will have a regulation that will allow us to plan ahead and to build bridges and to go forth, because member states then otherwise would have to step up, and in the current setting I believe that is even more challenging than finding space in a future MFF.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd ask if there are any panelists want to make any closing statement. I think there was certainly there was some opportunity. We identified maybe some practical next steps that could be taken with whether it's stakeholders identifying on their own or EUnetHTA drafting options within the process of various, whether it be clinical assessments or early dialogues where stakeholders could be involved and having stakeholders reflect on that, and having a meeting that seems to be open to being facilitated by the Commission, then I think that's a pragmatic next step. It seems that and maybe that would also support a more consistent interaction going forward. So do I hear any burning desire to make any statements? Well, with that, I'll ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for providing their remarks today. And I'd also like to thank you all. You've been a very engaged audience through the day, hung in there to the last session. So thank you very much. Oh.
Before you leave, our host organization would like to say some few words, and then I'll have one more household item, and then you can run off.
Well, at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Alrik Rüther. I'm heading the international affairs at IQWiC, and on behalf of our directors, Jürgen Windeler and Stefan Lange, I would like to thank you all for coming to Cologne, our home and our base here. I hope you will join later on together and continue the discussion outside in our beautiful town thereafter. Man, you may relax now, because I'm not trying to bore you with a long and sophisticated summary of the day. I do think assessment process 2.0, lots of quality processes, horizon scanning, life cycle approach, collaboration in every corner, shifted dynamic landscape, not to forget TISP, ED, JA, PLAC, and RIA. I do think almost enough food for continuing collaboration and discussing thereafter in Cologne and wherever you will go there. But there's even more, please, please. Have a look at this brochure if you haven't done that. It does not contain only the day of today, it contains the up-to-date work of all the work packages. And if you have read that and you're even hungry thereafter, there's the EUnetHTA magazine waiting for you. So you have enough food for eating a lot on with EUnetHTA. Coming to the end, to this, there are some thanks I would like to give. First, to Michel Moujomdar, I might say, for this great program and for leading us all very, very nicely through all of this. I think this deserves a big, big applause. Michel. And my second thank goes to Marcus Guardian and the team of ZIN. What a tremendous organization, my dears. Incredible. Thank you so much for this. This was really, really impressive. So I also think we have to clap for them. Well, and finally, I will let you off and thank all of you for participation, discussing and everything. And in the end, I would like to give on your way what EUnetHTA means. And you find it also in this very nice magazine. EUnetHTA means collaboration. EUnetHTA means taking decisions together. And EUnetHTA means sharing responsibility. With that, I would like to wish you a nice coming back home, or wherever you want to go, and we see all of you at the next forum for EUnetHTA. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure to have you. I want to add nothing to the words of thanks other than I'm very proud of my team, which did an amazing job. I would like to get up. Ali, the architect of today's meeting, excellent. Ewald, our tech champ. And Denise, the neck behind everything. Having said that, I just wanted to do an announcement for the Commission now. So apparently now I'm a spokesperson. There will be an event on EU cooperation way forward stakeholders. So here is an invitation, very important, and this is the 9th of July. So please keep that in your agenda and check the internet. I think it will be published there.
Next week.
Next week. Goodbye. Thank you very much.